In 1985, a young researcher in Munich did something almost nobody believed was possible. He took a fragment of tissue from a 2,400-year-old Egyptian child mummy, and inside it, he found something that should not have survived the desert, the embalming oils, the resin, the centuries. He found DNA, actual readable fragments of the molecule that once built a living child's body, still sitting there in the wrappings, waiting. His name was Svante Pääbo, and at the time, almost no one in the scientific world took him seriously. The idea sounded like science fiction. DNA is fragile. It breaks down in heat, in moisture, in the slow chemical violence of time. Egypt is one of the hottest, driest, most punishing environments on Earth for biological preservation. And yet here it was, a whisper of genetic code reaching across 2,500 years, and it was about to rewrite the rules of what we thought we could ever know about the people beneath the wrappings. For decades after that discovery, hope curdled into disappointment. Lab after lab tried to replicate what Pääbo had found, and lab after lab failed. Some scientists began to suspect his original results were contamination, modern DNA, that had crept into ancient samples through careless handling, through the breath and sweat and skin cells of everyone who had touched a mummy since Napoleon's soldiers first started hauling them out of tombs. The consensus hardened into something close to certainty. Egyptian mummies, wrapped in linen and soaked in resin, baked for millennia under desert heat that regularly climbs past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, simply did not preserve usable genetic material. If you wanted ancient human DNA, you went to the cold places, Siberia, the Alps, the permafrost of the Arctic, where the ice itself acted as nature's freezer, locking its own genetic memory the moment it tried to preserve its dead. But theories, especially convenient ones, have a way of collapsing the moment somebody refuses to accept them. And what nobody could have guessed, back when Egyptian mummy DNA was written off as a scientific dead end, is that the very ambition of the ancient Egyptians, their obsession with defying decay, their relentless chemical war against the natural process of decomposition, may have accidentally created something extraordinary, not immortality of the body, something stranger, a kind of accidental time capsule for the molecule of life itself, one that scientists would spend 40 years learning. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what DNA actually is, and why every cell in every mummy in Egypt carries a story more detailed than any hieroglyph ever carved. DNA is not just a blueprint, it's a memory. Every strand is a twisting ladder of molecular letters, 4, chemical bases repeating in patterns across 3 billion positions, that together encode everything a body needs to build itself, repair itself, and, crucially, remember where it came from. Buried inside that code are the fingerprints of every ancestor a person ever had, stretching back not just generations, but tens of thousands of years, folded into segments passed down mother to child, father to child, family line to family line, like a genetic river with countless tributaries. When you sequence the DNA of a single person, living or dead, you are not just reading their biology. You are reading a compressed history of human migration, conquest, trade, love, and survival. And when that person happens to be someone whose bones were sealed in a tomb during the age of the pyramids, you are potentially reading a chapter of human history that has been sealed shut for nearly 5,000 years. The first real crack in Egypt's genetic silence came not from a pharaoh's tomb, but from something that had eluded researchers for 3 decades. Working with samples pulled from 151 mummified remains recovered from Middle Egypt, the team successfully extracted usable genetic material from 90 individuals, spanning roughly 1,300 years of history from the New Kingdom through the era of Egyptian remains. And the results upended a long-standing assumption. These weren't royal mummies. They were regular people, embalmed with regular means, and yet their DNA had survived where scientists thought was happening inside the tombs themselves. Cool, dry, remarkably stable microclimates. That, ironically, may have protected genetic material far better than the blazing surface world outside. What the DNA revealed was almost more fascinating than the fact that it had survived at all. The ancient Egyptians in this study shared closer genetic ties to populations in the Near East than to the people who live in Egypt today. Modern Egyptians, the data suggested, carry noticeably more sub-Saharan African ancestry than their ancient counterparts did, a genetic shift that appears to have taken hold in the centuries after the Africa that history books rarely capture in this kind of granular detail. It was a quiet, staggering revelation. For thousands of years, people had debated Egyptian identity through art, through language, through architecture and religious iconography. Now, for the first time, there was a biological record written, not in stone, but in the molecule that builds every living thing. And it was telling a story. And if the DNA of ordinary Egyptians could hold that much history, imagine what might be hiding inside the blood of a king. In the early 2000s, Egypt's most famous mummy became the subject of one of lasting less than a decade. For nearly a century after Howard Carter cracked open his tomb in 1922, Tutankhamun's life remained a puzzle wrapped in gold and unanswered. Questions. Who were his parents? Why did he die so young? Why was his body riddled with his own body had betrayed him before he'd barely become a man? The answers, it turned out, were written into his genes, and in 2010, a team led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, working alongside geneticist Karsten Pusch, finally went looking for them. What they found, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, rewrote the boy king's story in a way that felt almost uncomfortably intimate. Genetic testing confirmed that Tutankhamun's parents were siblings, a brother and sister, most likely the pharaoh Akhenaten, and one of his own sisters, a practice not uncommon among Egyptian royalty, who believed their bloodline was sacred enough to remain unmixed with the world outside the palace. That single genetic fact helped explain so much of what had puzzled researchers about Tutankhamun's fragile body. Inbreeding concentrates genetic risk, increasing the odds of inherited disorders, and the DNA evidence lined up disturbingly well with what CT scans had already shown: a cleft palate, a clubfoot, bone necrosis eating away at 2 of his toes from restricted blood flow. But the researchers found something else too, something almost nobody expected to survive 3,000 years inside a mummified body. Traces of Plasmodium falciparum, malaria. The same parasite that still kills hundreds of thousands of people every year today had left its molecular signature inside 4 of the royal mummies tested, Tutankhamun among them. The leading theory to emerge from the study was that a combination of severe malarial infection and the bone necrosis in his leg, perhaps triggered by a fall, weakened and poison, as legend had long speculated, but by the same disease and bone combination that could have felled anyone in the ancient world, if the DNA is read correctly. That last qualifier matters, and it's worth pausing on, because ancient DNA science is not a field of absolute certainty. It is a field of probabilities, of competing interpretations, of researchers arguing fiercely over how confident anyone can really be about degraded genetic material extracted from remains that are thousands of years old. Some scientists have pushed back on parts of the Tutankhamun malaria theory since it was published, questioning whether the genetic markers used to detect the parasite were specific enough, or whether contamination might have played a role. This is the unglamorous truth behind every dramatic genetic headline. Ancient DNA doesn't come out of a mummy in tidy, complete strands, ready to be read like a book. It comes out shattered, fragmented into tiny pieces, chemically degraded, often contaminated with the DNA of bacteria, fungi, insects, and every human being who has touched the specimen across a century of archaeology. Reconstructing a genome from that wreckage is less like reading a letter and more like reassembling a shredded document that's been sitting in a flooded basement for 3,000 years, using only a few thousand of the scattered fragments that happened to survive. Which is exactly why what happened in the summer of 2025 felt less like an incremental discovery and more like the field finally clearing a hurdle it had been running at for 40 years, passed since the earliest failed attempts to extract usable DNA from Egyptian mummies. And in all that time, no genomic record of ancestry from early Egypt had ever existed for scientists to actually compare against. This was the first one, ever. The man himself, now referred to by researchers using the name of the village where his remains were found, Nuweirat, roughly 165 miles south of Cairo, was not a pharaoh. There was no gold, no elaborate sarcophagus, no army of servants entombed to serve him in the afterlife. He was buried in a large ceramic pot, inside a rock-cut tomb carved into a hillside, at a time before Egypt had developed the elaborate resin and linen mummification techniques that would later define its royal burial practices. And in one of the strange ironies that keeps showing up throughout the story of ancient DNA, that relative simplicity may be exactly what saved him, because he predated the chemically intensive embalming processes that later became standard practice, and because the ceramic pot likely created a more stable, buffered microenvironment, his remains avoided some of the degradation that destroys genetic material in more elaborately treated mummies. The elaborate rituals designed to prepare a body for eternity may have actively worked against the survival of DNA, while a simpler burial almost accidentally preserved it. What his genome revealed was a story of connection that historians had long suspected his genetic ancestry traced back to populations native to North Africa. But the remaining fifth of his DNA carried signatures linking him to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, the region spanning modern-day Iraq, Iran, and the wider Mesopotamian world. For years, archaeologists had noted intriguing cultural parallels between early Egypt and Mesopotamia, similarities in pottery styles and early writing systems, and agricultural practices that hinted at contact between these two, cradles of civilization. But cultural parallels can always be explained away as coincidence or as ideas spreading through trade without any actual movement of people. DNA doesn't allow for that kind of ambiguity. A fifth of this man's ancestry did not arrive in his body through a good story passed between merchants. It arrived because, at some point in the deep past, actual human beings from the Fertile Crescent had children with people whose descendants ended up on the banks of the Nile. It was, quite literally, physical proof written into a body that two of the ancient world's most important civilizations weren't just trading goods and ideas, they were mixing bloodlines. There is something almost eerie about the level of intimacy this kind of science allows. From the DNA and skeletal analysis, researchers were able to reconstruct not just this man's ancestry, but fragments of his actual physical existence. He was likely in his 60s when he died, elderly by ancient Egyptian standards, at a time when average life expectancy hovered dramatically lower than it does today. Wear patterns on his bones suggested a life of hard physical labor, possibly pottery work, his body carrying the accumulated stress of decades of manual strain. And using facial reconstruction, techniques pioneered by forensic anthropologist Caroline Wilkinson, scientists were able to build an approximation of what his face may have looked like, a face nobody had seen in nearly 5,000 years, rebuilt not from artistic guesswork, but from the geometry of his own skull and the genetic markers embedded in his own cells. But here is where the story opens up into something far bigger than one man's genome, because this discovery wasn't meant to be the end of the search. It was meant to be the crack in the dam. Egypt has now launched what may be the most ambitious genetic archaeology project the country has ever attempted, the National Egyptian Genome Project, coordinated through the Egyptian Center for Research in Regenerative Medicine and led in part by geneticist Yehi Agad, who has spent years working to build the country's own ancient DNA laboratory capacity rather than relying solely on foreign institutions. The project's ambitions are staggering in scope. Researchers intend to nation access to its own molecular family tree, to trace with scientific precision exactly how the population of modern Egypt connects, diverges, and evolved from the people who built the pyramids, who ruled as pharaohs, who lived and died along the banks of the world's longest river across more than 5,000 years of continuous civilization. The implications of a project like this stretch far beyond archaeology. Every genome pulled from a mummy is also a medical record. Ancient DNA doesn't just carry ancestry information, it carries mutations, disease markers, and evolutionary adaptations that reveal how humans responded to the pressures of their environment over thousands of years. Scientists studying ancient Egyptian remains have already found genetic evidence of malaria exposure at the molecular level, evidence of skeletal disorders passed down through royal bloodlines, weakened by generations of intermarriage, and clues about how populations along the Nile adapted biologically to agriculture, and sometimes didn't survive. Specific genetic burdens helps modern medicine understand how those same genetic patterns still shape human health today. And this is where the story of Egyptian mummy DNA connects to something happening right now on the frontier of genetic science in laboratories that have nothing to do with archaeology at all. The same underlying technology that lets scientists tease a readable genome out of a 5,000-year-old tooth is part of a much larger revolution in how humanity is learning to read and increasingly rewrite the code of life itself. Ancient DNA recovery relies on many of the same sequencing techniques being used to map the genomes of living species, to identify disease-causing mutations in newborns, to trace the deep evolutionary relationships between humans and our extinct relatives like the Neanderthals, whose own genome was first sequenced by the same Svante Pääbo, who, decades earlier, had pulled that first fragile signal of DNA from an Egyptian child mummy and been dismissed for it. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 2022 for that work, and that tension between what ancient DNA can rigorously prove and what excitement can tempt people into overstating runs through the entire story of Egyptian genetic archaeology too. It is tempting when a headline announces a pharaoh's DNA has finally spoken after 3,000 years of silence, to treat every conclusion as absolute fact. But the scientists doing this work are far more careful than the headlines that follow them. A single genome, even a complete one, represents exactly one person out of a population that, at its peak, likely numbered in the millions across Egypt's long history. One man's ancestry, however fascinating, cannot single-handedly rewrite the story of an entire civilization's origins. Researchers studying the Nuweirat genome have been explicit about this limitation, describing their find as an important first data point rather than a definitive answer, and stressing that far more samples will be needed before scientists can speak with real confidence about broader patterns of migration and mixing across Egypt's dynastic history. That kind of caution isn't a weakness in the science, it's exactly what makes the science trustworthy. And ancestry isn't the only kind of secret buried in these bodies. Sometimes DNA solves a murder. For nearly a century, one of the most disturbing mummies in the Egyptian Museum sat largely unexplained, a body. Researchers came to call the screaming mummy, its mouth frozen open in what looked like a final agonized cry. its body wrapped not in the fine linens of royalty, but in the untanned skin of a goat, a material considered ritually unclean, a burial designed to deny the dead a peaceful afterlife. For decades, historians suspected this was Prince's. Pentaur, son of Rameses III, implicated in a palace conspiracy recorded on an ancient papyrus known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, a document describing a plot by one of the pharaoh's secondary wives to assassinate him and place her own son on the throne instead. CT scans of Rameses, the third's own mummy, had already revealed a devastating detail invisible to the naked eye, a deep wound slicing through his throat all the way to the bone, hidden beneath the wrappings for 3,000 years, the physical proof of an assassination hinted at in text, but never confirmed in flesh. Genetic testing on the screaming mummy went further still, comparing Y chromosome markers between the two bodies and confirming a father-son relationship consistent with the ancient account. The unusual position of the body, the twisted, contorted expression, the deliberately impure burial materials, all suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. This wasn't just a body. It was a punishment, preserved in death for a crime that DNA, thousands of years later, would help confirm actually happened. What makes this story so quietly extraordinary, though, isn't just the technical achievement of pulling a readable genome out of a 5,000-year-old tooth. It's what that genome represents, philosophically, about the nature of identity itself. For most of human history, our sense of who our ancestors were and where we came from has been built out of stories, religious texts, oral traditions, national myths, carved into monuments and repeated across generations, often shaped as much by the political needs of the people telling them as by any underlying truth. Ancient DNA offers something different. It offers a record that doesn't care about politics, doesn't care about which dynasty wanted to claim divine or foreign origins, doesn't bend to the narrative pressures that shape every other form of historical record. A strand of DNA extracted from a 5,000-year-old tooth simply is what it is. An unbiased molecular fingerprint of exactly which populations contributed to exactly which bodies, passed down without agenda, without propaganda, without embellishment. In a species that has spent its entire existence telling itself stories about where it came from, DNA is the first storyteller that cannot lie. And there is something profoundly moving in that. Somewhere in the genetic code, recovered from that tooth in Nuweirit, sits proof that a man who lived and worked and grew old on the banks of the Nile nearly 5,000 years ago carried within his own body the intertwined histories of two of civilization's earliest cradles, Africa and the Fertile Crescent, mixed together not through myth or metaphor, but through actual human connection, actual relationships, actual children born from people who crossed vast distances long before recorded history could properly track them. He never could have. Known that his DNA would outlast every empire that rose and fell around him, every language spoken in his lifetime, every religious belief he held, and would still be legible, still be readable, nearly 5 millennia later, to scientists working with tools built on principles of physics and chemistry he could never have imagined. His body is gone, his name is unknown, but the molecular story, written into every cell he ever grew, still exists, and it is still being read. That is, in the end, the real secret hidden inside Egyptian mummies. Not curses, not conspiracies, not the sensational headlines that have followed pharaohs' tombs since the moment Howard Carter's lantern first illuminated Tutankhamun's golden mask. The real secret is quieter and, in its own way, more astonishing. It is the discovery that the human body, even wrapped in linen, even soaked in resin, even baked for thousands of years under one of the most punishing climates on Earth, can still carry a readable memory of exactly where it came from. Every mummy pulled from Egyptian soil is not just a preserved body. It is a sealed letter, written in a language humanity only learned to read within the last few decades, addressed to whoever someday would develop the tools and the patience to open it. 40 years ago, a young scientist in Munich cracked that seal open for the first time and was told he was wrong. Today, an entire national genome project is being built on the proof that he wasn't, and somewhere in a laboratory, drawer, sitting in careful storage, waiting for the next generation of sequencing technology to get even more precise, there are almost certainly more of these letters still unopened, still holding their silence, still carrying stories about who we are, where we came from, and how far a single molecule can travel across 5,000 years to remind us that we were never as disconnected from the ancient world as we thought. Carry your story well.